Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Some people only show respect when they see a suit, an expensive watch, or a famous last name. But what happens when the owner of the restaurant walks in wearing worn-out jeans, an old cap, and a genuine desire to hear what no one dares to say? That's how one of the most unsettling and transformative stories you'll hear today began. Because this surprise visit wasn't driven by profit, it was fueled by a suspicion that behind the polite smiles of customer service, something more harmful was hiding. Contempt disguised as efficiency. The most surprising part? The man who overheard something outrageous at the counter didn't shout, didn't fire anyone on the spot, and didn't make a scene. He chose something bolder, to let the mistake become a mirror, to let arrogance expose what name tags can't, to let prejudice reveal what so many prefer to ignore. If you think you've heard it all when it comes to transformation stories, think again. This one might change the way you see others, and maybe even how you treat those who cross your path every day. In the end, you'll realize that true revolutions don't start in boardrooms. They begin in the silence of a service counter, when someone decides to truly listen. It was just another day at the restaurant. Business as usual, until a man in worn jeans and a cap walked in quietly. No one recognized him, and they weren't supposed to, because among the customers, disguised and silent, was the very founder of the chain, a man who had given jobs to hundreds of people in vulnerable situations. Ricardo didn't come for praise. He came for real stories, the kind no one dares to tell when the boss is around. While waiting in line, he heard something that made his spine shiver. The employee Murilo was laughing loudly and mocking an elderly man, calling him a dirty old man, and joking that he looked homeless, as if poverty were a sign of failure. Ricardo had to hold himself back from stepping in, but it wasn't the time. Sometimes to truly transform a place, we must first listen to the stories whispered behind closed doors. It's in moments like this that the mask of company culture falls, and truth appears with all its wrinkles. Murilo, unaware, was being watched by the owner himself. Worse yet, he wasn't alone. Other employees laughed along, accomplices to a silent ignorance. Ricardo wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who knew what the street tasted like, and what it meant to be invisible. That's why he decided to stick with the plan, and begin an experiment that would reveal far more than he expected. Ricardo never liked the spotlight. He preferred silence to long speeches, and active listening to authoritative commands. Since founding the restaurant, he knew the real stories of a business aren't found in reports. They live in what's said when no one important seems to be listening. That's why he used a disguise. Jeans, a cap, and a curious gaze were all it took to expose the truth many ignored. This wasn't about distrust. It was about care. Ricardo had built the business on inclusion, hiring people whom society had forgotten, former inmates, single mothers, teens with no education. Every uniform in that place carried a story of second chances. That's why hearing an employee mock a vulnerable person felt like a stab in the back. What was meant to be a soulful restaurant had become a stage for arrogance dressed up as competence. Funny how masks fall when they think no one's watching. Ricardo realized the problem wasn't just Murilo. It was the culture that had taken root. That cruel laugh didn't come out of nowhere. It grew in the comfort of a space that had never been confronted by another's pain. And in that moment, the quiet businessman understood. If he truly wanted to change things, he would need to lead by example, not by force. And the first step was revealing who he really was. The next day, the atmosphere had changed. Ricardo walked through the same door, but this time no cap, no worn-out jeans, no silence. He wore a sharp suit with a firm but sad expression. Just walking across the room was enough to raise curious, anxious glances. That simple man from the day before was actually the owner of it all, and now he carried a story no one could ignore. He gathered the staff. No shouting, no threats, just words that cut deeper than any reprimand. I saw it, I heard it, and it was one of the most shameful things I've ever witnessed in this company. Silence. Some looked down, others swallowed hard. Murilo, shaken, was still trying to grasp what was happening, but Ricardo didn't want destruction. He wanted transformation, because the most powerful stories are not the ones that punish, but the ones that awaken. And that's why, instead of pointing fingers, he made an unusual decision for a CEO. Murilo wouldn't be fired. Not yet. He would be relocated. For a month, he'd go through a radical immersion, not to pay for what he did, but to see the world through new eyes. And when someone gives up punishment in favor of awareness, you can be sure a big shift is coming. In the very first days at the new unit, Murilo realized that place wasn't just different. It was a mirror. Each person he served carried a weight he'd never imagined. A woman who lost everything after escaping an abusive marriage. A former physics teacher now homeless, still dreaming of teaching. A 12-year-old boy with a notebook full of recipes, hoping to become a chef one day. Living stories you never see on TV. Arrogance gave way to silence, and silence led to listening. Murilo learned that serving someone who's hungry takes more than skill. It takes presence. It wasn't just a tray. It was the care in his eyes, the patience with each person's rhythm, the name he asked before handing over the plate. Slowly, it all started to make sense. Every small gesture he once dismissed now carried weight. And that, my friend, can't be taught in slides, only in human connection. As the weeks went by, Murilo no longer did anything on autopilot. He looked people in the eye, asked their names, remembered their preferences. He understood that empathy isn't about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's about respecting their path, even when you don't fully understand it. The stories he once ignored now became the topic of coffee breaks, chats with coworkers, and thank you notes from grateful customers. He had become more human, without even realizing how visible that was. It wasn't rare to see him cleaning a table more carefully or setting aside extra utensils when he saw a mother arrive with young children. Small details, big impact. One elderly client once told him, "You seem like someone who's been hit by life and chose not to hit back with anger." Murilo smiled. He knew he was now reaping what he once overlooked, the value of listening without judgment, acting without hurry, and caring without fear. One late afternoon, while wiping down a table, Murilo found a napkin with a handwritten message. "Thank you for treating me like a person even when the world sees me as nothing." He held that napkin for a long while. There was no name signed, but something more powerful than any signature was there: truth. And it was in that moment he understood. Respect isn't a protocol, it's a daily choice. And every choice, when made with intention, has the power to transform lives, including your own. A month had passed when Murilo returned to the unit where it all began, but he was no longer the same young man. He arrived earlier than usual, took a deep breath in front of the locker room mirror, and put on his uniform as if putting on a commitment. He didn't come back to defend himself or to justify his mistakes. He came to share the histories that had transformed him, not to move others, but to awaken them. Because those who truly change don't return to show off, they return to serve. During the team meeting, his hands trembled, but his voice came out steady. He spoke of the teacher who taught physics using bottle caps, the woman who prepared meals using donations, and the boy who showed him that respect can fit inside a smile. The once noisy room sank into a silence that wasn't awkward. It was attentive. Murilo apologized, not for the words he once said, but for failing to see the histories behind the people he served. In the end, there were no boos, no embarrassment. There was applause. Not the polite, routine kind, but the kind born when someone has the courage to admit they were wrong, to learn, and to come back ready to contribute. Ricardo, watching from the back of the room, smiled silently, not out of pride but gratitude. He knew, the histories that change us are not those that end with a mistake, but those that begin with one. Ricardo, always observant, wasn't the type to compliment for convenience, but when he saw Murilo greeting customers naturally, calling each by name, even apologizing when he made a mistake, he sensed something different. The change wasn't just in words, it was in his soul. Murilo hadn't just learned, he had transformed into someone capable of teaching. That's why Ricardo did something unexpected. He promoted him. Murilo's new mission would be to train employees across the company, focusing on respect, active listening, and human sensitivity. His new role didn't depend on a resume, it depended on experience, and he had enough histories for that. Rather than repeat corporate manuals, he taught by example. He showed how to offer water before someone asked, how to notice when someone needed attention more than a full plate. The most impressive thing, he didn't use a teacher's tone. He didn't pretend to be the hero of his own journey. He simply shared what he saw, what he felt, and what changed inside him. During each training session, he made space for others to share their histories too, because he had learned through practice that every culture begins with a gesture, but it only solidifies through listening. A few days later, Ricardo returned to the restaurant, this time with no disguise, no announcement, no scheduled meeting. He sat in a random corner, ordered a simple sandwich, and quietly watched the room. It was almost poetic to see Murilo, now calmer, warmly welcoming the same kind of customer he once disdained. An old man arrived, worn-out clothes, soft voice, and before he could say anything, Murilo was already offering him water and attention. "Good to see you again, Mr. Armando." "The usual, right?" he said naturally. The man smiled, eyes shining with a gratitude that needed no words. From across the room, Ricardo closed his eyes for a moment. This was it. Not the profit, not the growth, not the fancy facade, but the histories being honored, one by one, tray by tray, gesture by gesture. The restaurant was, once again, what it was always meant to be, a place of dignity. As he was leaving, Ricardo glanced at the counter and saw a message scribbled on a small board, written in crooked handwriting by a customer. "Thank you for seeing us before our ID." He took a photo, not to post, but to remember that the histories that change the world aren't shouted. They're served in silence, with listening, with soul, and with respect. In the first few days at the new unit, Murilo realized that place wasn't just different. It was a mirror that didn't distort but reflected raw truth. No filters, no excuses. Every face at the counter carried something he had never seen in the monthly reports or performance metrics. These were raw lives. People who were hungry, yes, but not only for food, hungry for respect, for kindness, for a look that said, "I see you," and little by little, that began to break him down. There was a woman with strong eyes and hesitant steps who, after a few days, shared, between orders, that she had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but a plastic bag. Now she was trying to start over selling crafts on the street. Her smile held dignity, her shoulders bore fatigue, and Murilo, for the first time, listened without interrupting. There was also an old man who collected cans in the park and showed up every Wednesday. Only later did Murilo learn he was a former physics teacher, educated, respected, and now invisible to the world. Still, he carried the spark of someone who believed in education as transformation. And then there was the boy, a 12-year-old boy who showed up every day with the same worn backpack and wide, attentive eyes, quiet, yet polite. One day, Murilo accidentally knocked over his pencil case, and along with the colored pencils, a battered notebook fell to the ground. Its title scribbled in pen, "My Recipes for the Future." Curiously, Murilo opened it. Inside were carefully drawn dishes, made-up ingredients, and a phrase written at the end of each page, "For when I become a chef." It hit him differently, like a gentle punch to the chest. He returned the notebooks, but never looked at that boy the same way again. It was impossible. That's when the arrogance, once his armor, gave way to silence. And the silence, once uncomfortable, became a doorway to listening. Murilo realized that serving someone hungry takes more than skill. It takes presence. It wasn't enough to deliver the right dish. He had to understand the story behind the hunger, the tone of voice, the wait time, the name spoken with respect. He, who used to avoid eye contact, began to look people in the eyes, to ask their names, to remember the details. "No onions. Right, Ms. Irene." Or, "We've got that sauce you like today, Mr. Alfredo." And the impact was visible. The histories began to seep into his daily life, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Every customer was a living chapter, and he, a supporting character who could or could not make a difference. And he did, through small gestures, an extra napkin, a glass of water before it was requested, a listening ear that didn't judge. His co-workers noticed, the manager noticed, but more importantly, he noticed. Murilo was changing, and the most beautiful part? He didn't even realize it. One ordinary afternoon while cleaning a table in the back, he heard the recipe boy quietly say without lifting his head, "Mister, thank you for calling me by my name. I thought no one remembered it anymore." Murilo froze, swallowed hard. That wasn't just gratitude. It was a plea for recognition, as if the boy were saying, "Please, see me, even if only for a moment." And in that moment, Murilo broke inside, because he understood he wasn't just serving meals anymore. He was delivering redemption. They were small stories, stitched together through simple yet deeply human gestures. A lingering glance, an unhurried good morning, a reassuring, Don't worry, we'll take care of it. He, who used to rush to meet targets, now insisted on serving with dignity. And even if the world outside remained in a hurry, inside that restaurant, there was time. Time to listen, to care, to begin again. During coffee breaks, Murilo began sharing the stories he heard with his co-workers. He told them about the woman who made packed meals with donations, the young man who wrote poems while waiting for his food, and the couple who celebrated their wedding anniversary with a single chicken croquette and 2 juices, things no one would post on Instagram, but that could change the mood of an entire day. And suddenly, that once hostile environment became a meeting point for hidden affections. He started jotting down names in a little notebook, not to keep control but to preserve memory, because he feared forgetting those voices, those glances. He feared going back to being blind to other people's realities. He knew that the respect he was cultivating was fragile. It had to be nurtured daily, so he nurtured it, with listening, with dedication, with gratitude. And the most symbolic moment came when a customer hugged him and said, "You look like someone who's been beaten down by life," and chose not to hit back. Murilo smiled, because deep down, that's exactly what he was. At that location, Murilo learned that people don't want pity. They want dignity. They want to be remembered as whole, even when everything around them tries to reduce who they are. And that can't be learned from a workbook or from a motivational speech. It has to be lived, felt. And that's how he learned. He learned that a uniform doesn't define character, that a sincere apology can heal more than we imagine, that empathy isn't about standing in someone else's shoes, but about respecting their space, even if you don't fully understand it. He learned that the most profound stories are told in silence, and sometimes a heartfelt good afternoon carries more weight than any speech. Today, when Murilo walks through the dining hall, he no longer sees just customers. He sees people. He sees past, present, and hope in every gesture. And each tray he carries is like a message. I see you. You matter. And that's why, even if no one applauds, he keeps serving with soul, because he understood that serving is also a form of loving. And in this rushed world, loving has become an act of courage. As the weeks went by, Murilo stopped doing things on autopilot. His stride changed. His gaze no longer passed over people, and his listening became intentional. He didn't memorize orders. He memorized names, preferences, quiet quirks. He knew who didn't like onions, who always asked for juice with little ice, who brought their own spoon from home. Over time, he understood that empathy wasn't about performing someone else's role like in a play. It was about respecting someone's space, pace, and story, even when it was completely different from his own. The stories he used to ignore now followed him home. He carried them in his mind like a favorite book. He'd talk to coworkers about the woman who came in twice last week just to smile, or the elderly man who had lost his wife and came to the restaurant to remember the times they ate there together. The stories didn't stay behind the counter. They crossed shifts, became conversation topics during coffee breaks, filled the space between one tray and the next, and most beautifully, they became transformation. Little by little, Murilo started to be noticed, not for speeches or performance, but for presence, for listening, for small gestures that, added together, had a huge impact. One day, for example, he saw an elderly woman spill her glass of water. Instead of rushing with a towel and complaining, he sat next to her and said, "Everyone spills something, Mrs. Lucia. Sometimes it's a glass, sometimes it's hope, but we clean it up and keep going." She smiled with teary eyes. In that moment, she wasn't just a customer. She was a story being embraced. It wasn't rare to see him cleaning a table more carefully than before, or setting aside extra utensils when he saw a mother arrive with young children. He started to read between the lines of the routine. When someone came in with sad eyes, he offered not just the menu, but presence. When a customer took too long to decide, he didn't rush them. He respected their silence. An elderly man once told him at the end of his meal, "You seem like someone who's taken hits from life and chose not to return them with hatred." Murilo smiled and felt a lump in his throat, because that was the truth. He had been shaped by pain, but refined by other people's stories. When he got home, tired, he still found the energy to open the little notebook he had bought at the corner newsstand. It wasn't pretty or expensive, but there he was building something rare, a diary of humanity. He'd jot down reflections, lessons, stray phrases that arose in the chaos of the day. 1. Underlined in red, read, respect is not demanded, it's offered, even when the other person doesn't know how to receive it. Another read, stories don't come with a manual, but they always bring a lesson. He no longer talked about goals or productivity. Now he talked about people, about invisible pains, silent joys, battles no one sees. And he realized something powerful. When we start truly listening to stories, something inside us shifts. Judgment gives way to curiosity. Impatience yields to affection. And that's when deeper transformation starts to grow. One day, a new employee said in the locker room, "Murilo is different, he really listens. It's like he hears even what we don't say." And maybe that was it. Because after so much time ignoring stories, he had become a specialist in noticing them. He saw doubts in the way customers walked. He saw silent cries for help in his coworkers' eyes. And more than just seeing, he embraced them. With presence, with care, with humility. Some managers started noticing a change in the environment. Complaints went down. Compliments increased. But what stood out most was the lightness. It was as if something invisible was being healed. And many understood. That didn't come from a training program. It came from the stories, from lived experience, from the silent example of someone who had learned in practice what no manual could teach. And Murilo carried on, without boasting, without seeking applause, just living truthfully. One day a little child hugged him and said, "You're like my uncle, only kinder." That made him laugh, but also reflect. Kindness is often the only thing someone will remember about us. And if that kindness is soaked in listening, presence, and care, it becomes a bridge. It becomes a story. The notes in the little notebook kept multiplying. One read, "Every customer carries baggage. It's not always light." Another, "Those who serve in a rush deliver food. Those who serve with soul deliver care." And he knew he wasn't a writer, but he was someone who, after making mistakes, chose to learn, and after learning, chose to teach, not with speeches, but through example. Many who used to mock him now sought him out for advice. They wanted to know how he did it, how he stayed so calm, how he had so much patience. And he answered simply, "I just listen. Everyone has a story, and no one walks in here by accident." That phrase became an unspoken motto in the restaurant. One Saturday, while tidying up the dining area, he found a note left on a table. It said, "Thank you for reminding me that there are still good people out there." Murilo kept that piece of paper like a trophy, because he understood that, deep down, stories don't want a stage. They want to be heard. They want respect. They want space. And that's why, without even realizing it, he became a role model, not for technical excellence, but for humanity. And that kind of leadership is rare, because it doesn't impose. It inspires. And he inspired, without knowing, just by being, just by serving, and above all, just by respecting each person who crossed his path, as if handling a rare book, with care, reverence, and gratitude. A month later, Murilo returned to the unit where it all began. But anyone watching him walk into that restaurant wouldn't imagine he had once been the target of so much criticism. He walked calmly, not with urgency, but with purpose. He arrived before opening hours, crossed the dining area in silence, and stood in front of the locker room mirror. There, with the light still off, he faced his reflection like seeing an old friend. He put on the uniform, straightened the apron, adjusted the collar, and at that moment, it wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol, a commitment, a transformation. He wasn't there to play the hero, much less to clear his name. Murilo knew that some wounds don't heal with ready-made speeches, and that some looks only trust again when they feel truth. So he chose to begin by listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to steer the conversation, didn't demand attention. He simply sat down, waited, observed. And when called to the front, he took a deep breath and stood up with a serenity that can't be taught in books, only earned through life. During the meeting with his colleagues, his hands trembled, but curiously, his voice did not. There was something steady, almost poetic in how he began. No technical jargon, no mention of targets, no corporate reports. He chose to tell stories, and it was those stories that opened doors. He began by recalling a physics teacher who taught using bottle caps, showing that with purpose any object can become a tool for learning. Then he spoke of a woman who made meals from donations and served them as if they were royal banquets. He said she taught him that dignity doesn't come from ingredients but from intention. But it was when he spoke about the boy that his voice cracked. a skinny kid wearing flip-flops and a torn backpack, who approached him in line just to thank him for the smile the day before. "You were the only one who looked at me like a person," the boy said. And Murilo, who until then thought he was doing the bare minimum, realized that when the minimum is done with soul, it becomes everything. The once noisy room fell into a heavy silence, not burdensome, but deep, the kind of silence that only appears when someone truly listens. And then he apologized, but not in the scripted way we often see in companies. It was a sincere apology, not for the harsh words he once spoke, but for failing to see the stories behind those he served, for confusing appearance with worth, for treating lives like numbers. He didn't beg for forgiveness, he simply acknowledged that, at some point, he had failed as a human being, and that this failure was, paradoxically, the starting point for everything that followed. In the end, there were no boos, no sarcasm, no eye rolls. There was something far rarer, applause, not the loud, exaggerated kind meant to be seen. These were short, heartfelt, meaningful claps. Applause for the courage to live it, admit it, and share it. Ricardo, watching quietly from the corner with teary eyes, understood in that moment that the mission had been fulfilled, and that no corporate training, no matter how expensive or high-tech, could have triggered what that moment did. Because there's a brutal difference between memorizing service protocols and truly understanding what it means to serve. And Murilo now knew that, with his whole being. He didn't talk about techniques. He spoke of feelings, lessons born from pain, shame, and humility. He spoke of being served by a woman with Alzheimer's, who smiled at him as if she had known him for years, and how it made him reflect on emotional memory. He spoke of a homeless man who declined coffee, saying he'd already had 2 that morning and it would be selfish to take another. Stories like these don't fit into spreadsheets. They stay on your skin. And that day, something shifted. Not just in Murilo, but in the whole team. His co-workers began sharing their own experiences. One server spoke about a time an elderly customer made her cry, not from anger, but from emotion, thanking her for noticing he needed company more than food. Another employee remembered his mother, who worked as a cleaner, and said he felt seen when Murilo spoke about dignity. Minutes turned into hours, and no one complained. Because everyone knew they were witnessing something rare, the rebuilding of a bond. After that morning, the unit's numbers didn't magically improve. There were still targets, complaints, the lunchtime rush, but something invisible had shifted. The atmosphere changed. Hallway conversations became kinder. Mistakes were handled with more patience, and the word stories began to circulate with renewed strength, not as a slogan, but as a lens that lets you see beyond the counter, beyond the name tag, beyond appearances. Ricardo knew what had happened wasn't a miracle. It was a process, the result of a hard but necessary decision. He hadn't wanted to punish Murilo. He wanted to teach him. And more than that, he wanted Murilo to teach others, not with theory, but with his own transformation. And it worked, because when someone falls, rises, and returns more human, more aware, more humble, that becomes the kind of example words can't explain. It can only be felt. And that's why, today, Murilo is called a mentor, not because of status, but because of respect. He became the kind of person who inspires without trying to impress, who corrects without humiliating, who leads based on what he's lived, not on what he's memorized. At the start of every new meeting, he makes sure to ask a simple question. What's the most beautiful story you've experienced here this week? And the amazing thing is, someone always has something to share, because in the end, that's what it's all about. Ricardo, always observant and quiet, was never the type to compliment for convenience or hand out titles under pressure. Over the years, he learned that true leaders don't show themselves in speeches, but in the actions no one sees. So when he returned to the diner and saw Murilo welcoming customers with authenticity, calling each one by name, offering water before they even asked, apologizing with humility when he made a mistake, he understood something had changed deeply there. And it wasn't just behavior. It was in the eyes, in the soul. Murilo wasn't just doing his job. He was serving with heart, with a kind of gentleness that can't be taught in traditional trainings. This wasn't a new customer service technique. It was an inner transformation materializing through small but powerful gestures. And that's why Ricardo did something unexpected. He promoted him, quietly, without a party, but with the certainty that he was planting a powerful seed. Murilo's new role went far beyond a badge with a fancy title. He would now be responsible for training the network's attendants, not with manuals, but with real, deep, transformative experience. Ricardo knew what Murilo now carried didn't fit on a resume. It overflowed through his actions. And there were many stories behind that posture. Stories that had made him not just a better employee, but a more conscious human being. In the first few days as a trainer, Murilo felt odd. He didn't want to seem superior, didn't want to be seen as the example, but he soon realized he didn't need to teach anything. He just needed to share what he had lived, to show, with simplicity, what he had learned from his own mistakes. He remembered every glance he avoided, every time he ignored someone because of their clothes or how they spoke. And now he understood that each of those failures was a chapter in the stories. He used to inspire others. Instead of lectures, he sparked conversations. Instead of rigid rules, he sparked reflection. He'd take his colleagues to the entrance of the diner and say, "Stay here for 10 minutes. But don't just look at who walks in. Try to notice who looks tired, who looks sad, who's forcing a smile to hide their hunger." And every time he did this, a new world opened up in front of the team. Because he wasn't teaching techniques, he was teaching them how to see people. Some were skeptical at first, others resisted. But just one day working beside Murilo at the counter was enough to notice how different his approach was. He didn't just serve orders, he delivered presence. He made eye contact, listened attentively, remembered details. He knew Donatita liked her juice without ice, that Mr. Jorge had high blood pressure and avoided salt, and that the girl with the yellow backpack always shared her sandwich with her younger brother. He knew all that not because someone taught him, but because he had learned to listen with his heart, and that's what he passed on. Ricardo, watching the early results, was moved in silence. He saw more customer smiles, lighter employees, and an atmosphere that no bonus or sales goal could buy. It was the kind of change that only happens when leadership comes from the inside out, when someone who once worked on the ground floor becomes a bridge between worlds that rarely connect. And that's why he often said with quiet pride, "There's no marketing more powerful than a well-lived story." Over time, the impact reached beyond the store. Other locations started to notice the difference. They asked to borrow Murilo for a few days. They wanted to know how he did it. They wanted to apply the same methods. But Murilo was clear. There's no method. There's listening. There's presence. There's responsibility for the stories that come to us. And just like that, unintentionally, he became a symbol of a deep, quiet change within the company. Trainings, which used to happen through slides and printed guides, started taking place on the shop floor, in the middle of the shift, with trays in hand and ears wide open. Murilo insisted on showing how every detail mattered, how a simple gesture could heal invisible pain, and how every customer carried a story that deserved to be respected, even in silence. The company culture began to shift. Some older managers, resistant to change, asked to leave. They said they were losing control. But Ricardo knew it wasn't a loss of control, it was a gain of awareness. And that's what truly mattered. Because controlling is easy. Connecting, that takes courage. And above all, humility. Murilo, for his part, never stopped working at the counter. Even with his new role, he insisted on spending at least one shift a week attending personally. He said it was to stay grounded, but deep down, it was because that counter had become his altar of reconnection. There, he didn't just serve food. He restored dignity. He built bonds. And most of all, he collected new stories. One day, a new employee asked him why he always wrote so much in a little notebook. Murilo smiled and replied, "To remember, because every name, every order, every detail is a story worth recording." And in that notebook, there was a bit of everything. Names, preferences, dreams overheard by chance. Because, as he would say, we can't change the whole world, but we can change someone's world. And that's already a lot. At the end of an especially hectic day, Ricardo quietly entered the store. From afar, he watched Murilo helping a customer with a disability find a more comfortable seat. Then, he saw him console a child who cried after dropping their food. Later, he paused for a few minutes, just to listen to an elderly woman talk about her loneliness. And in each gesture, a piece of that transformation was present. On his way out, Ricardo slipped a note into the pocket of Murilo's apron. It read, and just like that, the diner stopped being just a business. It became a place of reconnection, a refuge for those carrying invisible pain, a silent stage where stories found someone who truly listened. Because in the end, it's not the menus that nourish the soul, it's the encounters that honor each person's essence. A few days after that unforgettable episode, Ricardo returned to the restaurant. No cameras, no press, no chef's coat. He didn't want applause or an audience. He entered like anyone else, quietly, dressed in nothing but his silent presence and the attentive gaze of someone who had learned to truly listen. He chose a table in the corner by the window, where he could watch everything without being seen. He ordered a simple sandwich, the same one he used to get back when he was just an employee, and stayed there, as if waiting more for answers than for food. The dining room was calm, but what stood out was the behavior of the staff. Ricardo noticed the details, the softer tone of voice, the time spent with each customer, the care shown to the elderly man struggling to pay with coins. That's when Murilo appeared, the same Murilo who, weeks earlier, had mocked an old man behind the counter. But now, something had changed. It wasn't just his calmer expression, it was his eyes that had finally begun to see others. An older man entered, worn-out clothes, tired posture, barely audible voice. But before he could say a word, Murilo was already there with a glass of water in hand and a smile on his face. "Good to see you again, Mr. Armando. The usual, right?" he said, with a natural ease that seemed rehearsed by the soul. "Mr." Armando smiled with that unmistakable gleam in his eyes, the kind that only appears when someone treats us like a person, not a burden or a nuisance. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat. That small gesture, in that forgotten corner of the city, was worth more than any quarterly target. Because right there, behind a steel counter and plastic trays, something much greater was being served. Dignity. It was as if every dish handed over came with a chance to rewrite the world, one story at a time. And that's what he missed. Not the revenue, not the headlines, not the Manager of the Year awards. What Ricardo wanted, what he had always wanted without even knowing, was this: to see people's stories being acknowledged. Because deep down, a restaurant was never just a restaurant. It was a quiet stage where daily dramas unfolded, where a simple good morning could heal more than medicine, and where respect, that invisible ingredient, changed the flavor of everything. In the time he spent observing, Ricardo witnessed other small miracles. A server helping a mother with 3 kids get settled. A cook leaving the kitchen to personally hand a late delivery driver a meal. A young intern striking up a conversation with a lonely elderly woman just so she wouldn't feel invisible. None of this was in the training manual. None of this was taught in a workshop. It was something deeper, the awareness that behind every ID number, there was a story. Before leaving, Ricardo quietly passed by the counter. He didn't want to draw attention, but he couldn't help glancing at the bulletin board. Among the notices about shifts and days off, a simple handwritten note stood out. It was Murilo's handwriting. The message was short but said everything. "We don't need to have everything to give respect." Ricardo read it like one reads a prayer, because that wasn't just a note. It was a daily reminder, a silent commitment to what truly matters. In that moment, everything made sense. The disguise, the pain, the disappointment, the exposure, none of it would have been worth it without transformation. And there it was, quiet, real, alive, not in statistics, but in actions, not in profits, but in people. That's why this story had to be told. Not to shame anyone, but to remind us that in a world so quick to judge, there is still room to learn, change, and serve differently. Ricardo walked out with a light heart. He knew not every day would be perfect. He knew mistakes would still happen, that not everyone would understand right away. But he also knew something had changed, and that change was irreversible. Because when respect walks in the front door, prejudice slips out the back. Days later, in a meeting with the leadership team, Ricardo shared what he had seen. He said there would be no formal meeting about the episode, no need for a new training program or company-wide announcement. What needed to be done was already happening, in the best way possible, through the hands of those who had made mistakes and, with courage, chose to do better. On the break room wall, a new message appeared written in blue marker. Here, every tray carries a story, and every story deserves respect. This time, no one knew who wrote it, but that didn't matter. The spirit of change no longer needed a signature. It needed continuity. Months passed. The customer base grew, not because of advertising, but because of something far more powerful: word of mouth from people who had been treated with kindness. Loyal customers, the kind who always sat at the same table and ordered the usual, came back not just for the food, but for how they felt, for how they were seen, for the certainty that here, their stories mattered. And over time, even Murilo began to share what he had learned. In team meetings, he spoke about the day he almost lost his job over a thoughtless comment, and how that day marked a turning point. He spoke with humility, not as a martyr, but as someone who had faced his own shadow and chosen to walk toward the light. In one of those meetings, a newly hired young woman asked, "But why didn't Mr. Ricardo fire you on the spot?" Murilo paused for a few seconds, and then answered, "Because he believed we can be better, and that changes everything." The room went quiet, because in that moment, without even trying, Murilo had delivered the most powerful lesson of all: transforming people is far more valuable than punishing behavior. At the end of that year, the restaurant received a quiet tribute from the neighborhood association. No trophies or banners, just a handwritten card signed by dozens. At the top, a simple phrase, "Thank you for seeing us." Ricardo framed the card and hung it at the restaurant's entrance, not as decoration, but as a compass. Because at that door, every customer who walked in brought more than an order. They brought a story, and every one of them deserved to be heard with the heart. Now tell me honestly, no excuses. How many times have you judged someone just by their clothes, by the faded jeans, the worn-out shoes, the absence of brand names? How many times have you crossed paths with someone in the street or at work and, without even realizing, built an entire biography based on their appearance? Yeah, probably more times than you'd like to admit. And worse, how many stories did you ignore along the way? How many chances for learning, connection, or respect were thrown away simply because your eyes closed before your heart did? It's no exaggeration to say we live in a world that teaches us to judge before we listen, to measure worth by appearance instead of essence. But when a story like this knocks at your door, it exposes a truth many try to avoid. Respect is not a reward. It's a starting point. And empathy is not a bonus. It's the foundation. It doesn't matter if the customer arrives in a luxury car or wearing flip-flops, if they speak fluently or stumble through their words. What matters is the humanity standing in front of you, asking to be seen. And that's where responsibility begins, because this isn't just a touching story. It's a mirror that nudges you, that reveals, that makes you ask, what if it were me? What if I were the one behind that counter? If I were tired, rushed, distracted, would I have had the grace to treat someone with dignity, even if they looked ordinary? Or would I have only smiled after finding out who they really were? And what if it were my mother walking in? Simple, quiet, humble. How would I want her to be treated? That's why this story hits deep. Because it speaks to something beyond the counter, beyond the company, beyond the uniform. It speaks to consciousness, to stop automating behavior and start acting with presence. Because every gesture we make, no matter how small, can be the difference between someone feeling invisible or respected. And the truth is, many of the greatest transformations begin in the silence of a welcoming glance. Have you ever considered that maybe, just maybe, that slow-walking man you ignored in line could be someone with a powerful legacy? That the simply dressed woman you dismissed could have built something greater than any MBA? That's what stories reveal. They show that people's worth doesn't lie in what they flaunt, but in what they carry, in the weight of life, in their scars, in the wisdom learned not in classrooms, but through daily struggle. And do you know the true test of character? It's how you treat someone who you think has nothing to offer you. That's the measure. It's easy to be kind to the boss, the VIP client, the people we admire. The real challenge is maintaining respect when the other seems like a nobody to the world, because that's when integrity is tested. True professionalism, true humanity, and true ethics show up when no one is watching, when the mystery shopper has no badge, no famous last name, when they're just a person. If this story stirred something in you, turned you inside out, or made you swallow hard, then maybe it did its job. Because it wasn't told to entertain, it was told to transform, to make you see differently, think differently, act differently. Change doesn't start with big marketing campaigns or year-end motivational trainings. It starts in the way you treat your next customer, in how you look into the delivery guy's eyes, in the tone you use with the person serving your coffee, in the simple good morning that might break a cycle of invisibility. And more than that, this story is an invitation to flip the script, To be the example, even when no one expects it. To break free from autopilot and step into human mode. Because at some point in life, we'll all be on both sides of the counter, as the one serving and as the one needing to be served. And when we truly understand that, empathy stops being a fancy word and becomes a daily habit. Maybe you're wondering, but what can I do? The answer is simple, but not always easy. You can start by choosing not to repeat the mistake, choosing to be the example, choosing to listen to stories instead of ignoring them, choosing respect as the standard, not the exception. And do you know what happens when that choice becomes a habit? The environment changes. Relationships change. The company changes. You change. And it's not just about you. It's about the legacy you leave. Because people will forget what you said. They might even forget what you did. But they will never forget how you made them feel. And if you have the power to make someone feel lighter, seen, more human, then you have the power to change the world. One gesture at a time. One moment of listening at a time. One story at a time. So if this reflection stirred something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Comment below what touched you the most. Share it with someone who needs to rethink their attitudes. Tag someone who works with customer service, with leadership, with people, and of course subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. Because here we don't tell stories by chance. We tell them to provoke, to reflect, to transform. And tomorrow when you're back in the rush of daily life, remember this. Every person who crosses your path carries an entire universe inside. A universe that may open or close, depending on how you look at them. So what kind of impact do you want to leave? The choice, as always, is in your hands. And every great change begins with a simple decision. Listen more, judge less, and let the stories do what they do best. Transform.